Shavua Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Kilayim. We're up to Perek Zayin, Mishnah Zayin. We learned earlier in Mishnah Gimel that a grapevine that hangs over grain creates Kilayim of the vineyard. The Mishnah now is going to discuss more laws involving grain that is underneath a grapevine. Haruach she'il ala et hagefanim al gebet tvuah. If the wind blew grapevines over grain that was growing, and the Mefarshim explain that the grain and the grapevines were planted at the required distance from one another, but what happened was later the wind came and blew the vines above the grain. So the Mishnah says, Yigdom miad, the owner has to immediately cut the vines so that they don't hang over the grain, because if they are allowed to remain there, both the vines and the grain will become asur for benefit. And again, the Mefarshim explain that the reason the Mishnah specifically said to cut is because we're talking about a case where the vines were cracked or twisted in a way that you wouldn't be able to just turn it back. Therefore, it's using the language of cut. If, however, as a result of an onus, a unforeseen circumstance that is not in his control, he could not cut the vines. The Mefarshim explained, for example, he was mourning Shiva for one of his close relatives and he couldn't do any work, or the workers that he hired to remove the vines didn't come as they promised. Mutal, they are permitted for benefit, because again, we learned earlier a similar concept in chapter 5, Mishnah 6. Since the owner did not willingly allow them to stay there, the produce does not become prohibited to benefit from. Regarding a person's grain that was leaning beneath the vine, the Mefarshim explain that the grain was planted the required distance from the vine and was not directly beneath any of its branches. However, as the grain grew, it bent over so that part of the grain is now beneath the branches of the vine. V'chen beyarak, similarly regarding greens that are leaning beneath the vine, machazil, the owner has to turn the grains or the greens away from beneath the vine. Venu mikadesh, however, if they were not turned back, the vine does not make the grains or the greens asur. And the Mefarshim explain that even though we learned earlier in Mishnah Gimel that other species that are growing under a grapevine do become asur, that's only when the actual plant is growing under the vine. Here, however, we're talking about a case where the trunk or the stalk of grain or vegetable is not beneath the vine. Only the upper part of the grain or the vegetable is leaning under the vine. For this reason, the Mishnah, the halakha here is different than the first case in our Mishnah as well. What do we say? We learned if the vines are allowed to remain in a position over the grain, the vines and the grain become asur, because in that case, the vines are positioned over the main part of the grain. But here, they are not positioned over the main part. They only positioned over a upper part that is leaning under it. The Mishnah now is going to discuss how developed do grains and grapes have to be in order to become asur as Kilayim of the vineyard. From when in the development stage does grain become asur for benefit as Kilayim of the vineyard? The Mishnah says mishitashlish, from when the grain takes root, va'anavim, and from when do the grapes become asur? Mishia asur kefol alavan, from when they become the size of a white bean. The Mefarshim explain, if a person planted grain in a vineyard, the grain and the grapes do not become asur for benefit until the grain takes root and the grapes grow to a size of a white bean. Likewise, if a person planted grain in an existing vineyard whose grapes have not yet reached the level of the white bean, neither the grain nor the grapes would become asur for benefit until the grapes grow to that size. If the grain is uprooted before the grapes reach that size, the grapes do not become asur. Therefore, by Torah law, neither the grapes nor the grain become asur unless both have reached their critical stages. The grain having taken root, and the grapes reach the size of a white bean. However, midrabanan, the grain becomes asur when it takes root, even though the grapes are not the size of a bean. The rabbis only require one of the process for that item to become asur if it reached that stage. Like we just said, the grain becomes asur when it takes root, even if the grapes didn't reach the stage. The Mishnah now is going to define the latest stage at which grapes and grain can become asur as Kilayim. Tivuashi yavsha kol tzulka, grain that ripened fully and it dried to its full extent. Va'anavim shebashlu kol tzulkan, and grapes that have ripened to their full extent. And mitkachot, they do not become asur. Therefore, if a person plants grain in a vineyard whose grapes have already fully developed, or a vine among grain that is completely ripe, neither the grain nor the grapes become asur to benefit from. Here also, neither the grapes nor the grain become asur unless both have not yet fully ripened. Even if one of them ripened, that one would become Even if one of them had ripened and one of them didn't, the one that didn't would become masul. In order for the grapes and the grain to become masul, both have to be not at the stage of fully ripened. Because in order for the grapes and the grain to become masul, both have to be not at the stage of being fully ripened. That is Yom Rabotai, Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet now is going to discuss an interesting topic. We spoke about it earlier in more in Demai, a flower pot with a hole in it, which is large enough for a small root to fit through. It draws nourishment from the ground, even though it's not actually connected to the ground because of the hole that has a size for a root to fit in. The Mishnah now is going to discuss grain that was planted in a flower pot that had been placed in a vineyard or within its 4 amma work area. So you have grain in a flower pot put in this position. Atzitz nakuv mekadesh bakerem. If a flower pot with a hole in it was placed in a vineyard and then grain was planted in it, it prohibits for benefit both the grain in the flower pot and the grapes in the vineyard. V'sheno nakuv eno mekadesh. However, if the grain was planted in a flower pot that does not have a hole in it, it does not prohibit the grain in the flower pot or the grapes in the vineyard. And the Mifashim explained why. Because a flower pot that does not have a hole in it is not considered connected to the ground. Therefore, when a person plants grain in it, the grain is not being considered as planted in the ground. Therefore, it's not Kilayim of the vineyard. Midrabanan, a person is not allowed to plant grain even in a flower pot without a hole. However, if one violated this prohibition, the grain remains mutar to benefit from, as the Rambam tells us in Hilchot Kilayim, chapter 5, halakha 16. Rabbi Shimon Omer, however, Rabbi Shimon says, planting in both a flower pot with a hole and in a flower pot without a hole is forbidden. However, it does not make the grain or grapes prohibited to benefit from, because the Rav explains that Rabbi Shimon holds that a flower pot that has a hole in it has the same halakha as a flower pot that does not have a hole in it. In both cases, planting in the flower pot, Rabbi Shimon says, is not considered the same as planting in the ground. Even though it's asur to do it, it would not make the grapes or grapes or grain prohibited to benefit from. That is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The halakha is not like Rabbi Shimon. The halakha is like the Tanakama, that if it has a hole in it, it is asur and you can't benefit. If it doesn't have a hole in it, it's asur, but you can benefit from. The Mishnah discusses a related case and concludes, a person who brings a flower pot that has a hole in it, in which grains already took root through a vineyard, passing under the vines. The halakha is that if the grain increases by 1/200th while in the vineyard, the grain becomes asur. And the Mifashim explain that a foreign species would not become asur in a vineyard unless during that time in the vineyard it increases in size of the amount of at least 1/200th of its final size, like we learned earlier in chapter 5, Mishnah 6. However, the Mifashim do say, since the flower pot was only moved through the airspace and never rested on the ground, it would not prohibit the grapes, it would only prohibit the grain. In fact, for this reason, mid'oraita, even the grain is not asur. However, the Chachamim made a prohibition that if you pass through a vineyard with a flower pot with a hole in it, and it grew 1/200th of the size, the rabbis penalized them and they prohibited the grain. That is the end, Rabotai, of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.